My material's not copyrighted. You can use mine any way you want.
This one's for you, Kent.
If you want to get any of my video materials, they're not copyrighted.
Check it out. You're a fucktard, aren't you, Kent? You're a fucktard, aren't you, Kent? You're a fucktard, aren't you, Kent? You're a fucktard, aren't you, Kent?
Come on, Logic. It's time to make another hello, my name is Kent Hovind.
Not doing it.
But you must.
Didn't I ask you to stop using my video equipment?
Oh, you're so lazy, Logic.
I'm done with... Oh, too loud. I'm done with debunking. I think I almost died again from alcohol poisoning last time. Just get Armored Skeptic to do it.
He fell off his horse again.
Oh, fuck. Why did I shout him out anyway?
Now make a video, or we will both stop getting views.
I don't care. I'm not making a video. I'm just gonna lie here, ineffectively trying to cure my hangover with this homeopathic medicine, and that's the end of it.
But, Logic, you lose subscribers.
Yeah, I don't care.
You lose so many. All of those subscribers gone.
Oh. Alright, turn the background on. Oh god, my head. Turn the lights down. That's better. Ah, crap, I'm all see-through in this thing. I'm gonna go change. And get a coffee. Alright. Yes. Hello, Kent.
Then they tell the kids that these plants and animals, not only did life evolve from non-living material, then this life had to learn to reproduce itself.
Life inherently reproduces itself. That's why it's life. Do you think the first life form would have had to take a little sex ed class run by its daddy, the Rock, I guess is what you'd think?
Why would any organism want to reproduce more of its own kind when that's only going to increase competition for the food supply?
I'm pretty sure the first life wouldn't have been capable of understanding philosophies of population control. Or anything else for that matter. And who the hell are you to say it's irrational to reproduce? You have 3 kids, so either you think your reasoning is wrong, or you're no more rational on this subject than a bacterium is.
Why didn't they instead evolve the ability to live forever and be happy? Huh? You ever think about that?
No. I've never thought about that.
I was in a debate one time, and we had question and answer time at the end. The student stood up and he said to the evolutionist, he said, "Sir, how did male and female evolve?"
Oh, stop it. Looking at that serious-ass face of yours right after that comment about evolving to live forever makes me want to laugh, but if I laugh right now, I'll barf all over the floor.
The professor got up and he said, "Well, that is a giant mother may I step in the evolution story." A mother may I step? This is science. Wow. Well.
I'm too hungover for this crap, but even with this headache, I can think of some things I want to say, so I guess I better take care of it. Come on, you slavering hell beast! Bite me! Ah! Okay, now give me that hair. Oh yeah, that's better. So, fortunately, the entire body of scientific knowledge isn't determined by what's stored in one person's brain. Although it would be useful for him to have an answer ready for that one if he's doing live debates about evolution, because that's a giant mother may I step is just false and ridiculous. But you know, this is a pretty good example of why I think live debates about science aren't useful as anything more than entertainment. They rely on whatever information each participant has in their brain at that particular moment, and whether they can express it well within a very short amount of time, which becomes especially problematic against creationist slimebags, I won't name names, whose tactic consists of little more than throwing out so many nonsense claims that they can't possibly all be addressed without several hours of talking and access to a computer. So the male and female thing, let's talk about that. There are far more methods of reproduction, even still today, than just the two commonly known options of asexual division and mammalian-style sex. The methods of reproduction, like everything else that's evolved in nature, form a gradient, and even just looking at the wealth of reproduction strategies that still exist today shows us more than enough possibilities to work with as intermediate steps between asexual and male-female sexual reproduction. Now, life would have started out reproducing asexually, obviously, although you showed us earlier that you have little to no grasp on that concept. From there, we can move into genetic recombination, which occurs in bacteria through methods such as directly trading genes between bacterial cells or picking up DNA from the environment. The process of a bacterium connecting itself to another one and injecting DNA sounds kinda sexual, doesn't it? And then we have isogamy, which is reproduction with gametes that look the same and so are neither male nor female, which was probably the first true sexual reproduction. This occurs in some types of algae, yeast, fungi, and so on. You should note that this is sexual reproduction, but no sexes are involved at all. And then we get to anisogamy, where the gametes look different, like the egg and the sperm cells that we have. If an organism has this, it doesn't necessarily imply a lack of the ability to reproduce asexually, though. There are plenty of organisms capable of both sexual and asexual reproduction. Anisogamy also doesn't require that there are distinct male and female organisms. Some organisms are both male and female, while others have dedicated sexes. Some organisms can switch from male to female or vice versa. There are also organisms that, like us, have dedicated male and female sexes that don't change, but in which there's basically no sexual dimorphism, meaning that the males and females look basically identical. And of course, there are organisms like us, in which male and female have distinct morphological differences. So this little list of points on the reproductive gradient should give you pause if you ever decide to talk about the evolution of male and female again, Kent. When you acknowledge that there are more than just two types of reproduction with a mile-wide line between them, there's no need to assume an immediate jump from simple asexual reproduction to complex human-like reproduction with dedicated sexes and different anatomy, and the problem of the evolution of male and female becomes much easier. You think it's impossible because you have a childishly simplistic idea of how reproduction works. The first life form had to find somebody to marry because apparently, in your pathetic little world, reproduction involves a mommy and a daddy and 3 kids and a white picket fence, and asexual reproduction isn't even worth considering.
So according to them, for the next few billion years or hundreds of millions of years, life learned to produce something other than its own kind.
No, they say that for the next few billion years, life reproduced.
Of course, today everything only produces its own kind, but they say long ago and far away, they were able to do something different.
No, they say that kind is a poorly defined and therefore useless creationist concept which has no bearing on reality. Nobody knows or cares if descent with modification could produce different kinds until you clearly and unambiguously define the word kind. Once you've done that, demonstrate a mechanism that would place such limits on genetic change that the comparison of two organisms at opposite ends of a few 100 million years of evolutionary change would necessarily still be classified as the same kind, and scientists might start to think they have a reason to start listening to you. But so far, all we've heard from creationists is this. Oh shit, do I have a cricket infestation? Great, this is the last thing I need right now.
Textbooks will say we started like a bacteria and slowly evolved to a human. I think that's stupid. But if you want to believe that, that's perfectly fine.
We all know it eats you up inside. But that's perfectly fine.
Those trees of life that they put in the textbooks for your kids are a bunch of nonsense. And even evolutionists will admit that.
What's that quote from, an obituary? Mary Leakey died on December 9th, 1996, the day before whatever article that quote supposedly came from. I did manage to find an Associated Press article from December 10th on the death of Mary Leakey, but it contains nothing like your quote. That's not surprising, since why would anything like that be relevant when reporting on someone's death? Of course, as usual, it appears to only exist out of context on creationist websites. I challenge creationists to produce the original source and show it in full. Until then, I'm just going to assume that she's talking about the fact that the trees of life with their clear branching points of hominid ancestors are overly simplified and potentially confusing for students. Because if you can interpret out-of-context bits of nothing however you want, then so can I.
Stephen Jay Gould, the Marxist professor at Harvard University.
Marxist professor. I don't know or care if that's true because it's completely irrelevant to a discussion of his scientific position. I'd say that it's nothing more than a poisoning of the well to make sure that your most likely pretty anti-Marxist audience would think Gould is a big ol' meanie and so whatever he says next must be wrong, but the funny thing is, in this case, you actually want your audience to believe that your upcoming Gould quote is correct. But there must be a reason for mentioning it unless you have an odd compulsion to mention the political ideology of every person you quote about science, which until this point you haven't seemed to. I suppose maybe you're trying to make a point like, hey, this guy's a Marxist and even he says I'm right. Is that it? I don't know. In any case, it's a weird and stupid thing to say. And what would I expect from the guy in whose PhD dissertation, the document in which he would be motivated, perhaps more than in any other, to adopt a sober academic tone, the single brief paragraph on Erasmus Darwin began, and I quote, "Another man that is very important as we trace the history of evolution is Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin. He was born in 1731 and died in 1802. He was an extremely fat person. In fact, he was so fat that they had to cut a hole in the dining room table so that he could get up to the table. He was a medical doctor. He was also very immoral. He had 12 legitimate children and 2 illegitimate children. He was known to have had many affairs." End quote. The funny thing is that your supporters love to tell me how horrible I am for calling you a stupid liar when I call attention to your stupid lies, and yet they seem to have no problem at all with you prefacing discussions of scientists by pointing out their morbid obesity, serial adultery, or Marxism, without even trying to make it seem to serve your point.
He says that evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks are not the evidence of fossils. It's only inference. We infer, we imply, we hope it happened this way.
All that was on the end of the quote there, was it? I wonder why it wasn't on the screen then. It seems like it would really help to make your point. Anyway, as your slide shows, he didn't say that evolutionary trees in the textbooks are not evidence of evolution, probably since that'd be self-evidently true even to a grade schooler. But to the meat of your accusation, we infer, we imply, we hope it happened this way. Those words, infer, imply, and hope, are not even similar in meaning. He says infer, so how about let's go with that. What he says, and it's on the screen right now, is that there is data at the tips and nodes of the branching tree and the rest is inference. Of course, a complete tree diagram showing all data wouldn't fit on a textbook page, but he just uses that to illustrate what he's talking about. But what is this "the rest" that he's saying is inference? Well, as usual, and it's getting kind of old, it's gradualism, because he's talking about punctuated equilibrium. Big shock, Stephen Jay Gould talks about punctuated equilibrium. The document describes Gould's alternative method of explaining some of the gaps in the fossil record. His contention is that while change over time is evident, it's often abrupt, with whole species appearing and disappearing without a very smooth gradient. He explains that gradualists, including Darwin, argue that this is a result of the extreme imperfection of the fossil record. Gould, on the other hand, proposes that it's because of evolutionary stasis, that is, species remaining relatively unchanged over prolonged periods, and sudden appearance, that is, new species popping up quickly, likely to fill niches created by rapidly changed conditions. And Kent, you know as well as I do that Gould agreed that the rocks show evolution. He just didn't think that change matched the predictions of gradualism. You know, for all the quote mining you've done to him over the years, I hope he haunts you.
This textbook says, all the many forms of life on Earth today are descended from a common ancestor. What? You mean the birds and the bananas have a common ancestor?
Yeah? How are you surprised by that? Remember when you said this?
One of my favorite things to do is asking questions to people who believe in evolution.
Yeah, I guess you've been paying about as much attention to the answers as I predicted. But you've been demonstrating that since the beginning, so it's not like I'm real surprised or anything. Just thought I'd point it out because, well, I gotta pad this out to a dozen episodes somehow.
Found in a population of primitive unicellular organisms. Well, in the first place, there's no such thing as a primitive unicellular organism, okay? One single cell is more complex than a space shuttle.
Primitive doesn't mean lacking complexity, it means early, so how does the complexity of a cell relative to a space shuttle have any relevance here?
All the forms of life are descended from a common ancestor found in a population of primitive unicellular organisms. What were those first cells like? How do we know? What events led up to their formation? No traces of those events remain. Did you catch that?
Yeah, I caught that. What events led up to their formation? No traces of those events remain, and scientists can't travel backward in time to witness what happened. Instead, they turn to scientific methods of observing data, forming hypotheses, making predictions, and constructing experiments to test those predictions. No assertions, no claims to absolute knowledge, no pretensions to having it all figured out. Since that part of the past is so obscure, the only intellectually honest option available is to look carefully at life, come up with hypotheses about how it might have arisen, and do the experiments to find viable possibilities. Of course, there are dishonest options, like reading old books and pretending they're true, but I'm sure we're not entertaining that as a serious possibility. Hey, wait a minute, how'd we get back to abiogenesis?
Hey kid, we know what happened, but there's no proof.
The best evidence for your position that I've heard yet.
This one says, the humans, mammals, birds, crocodiles, all had a common ancestor. Well, anything inside that circle is religious speculation. It is stupid.
Nope. You didn't really expect me to waste more time on that, did you?
Reptiles produce reptiles, dogs produce dogs, people produce people, and there's never been an exception to that.
Yes, that's correct. Under the theory of evolution by natural selection, reptiles produce reptiles, dogs produce dogs, people produce people, and there's never been an exception to that. I'm pretty sure you already know that since it's been explained to you more than enough times, but of course your arguments only work against your stupid cartoonish strawman version of evolution, so you don't really have the option to represent it accurately, do ya?
David Ropp, who believes in evolution very strongly, says, in the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. In general, these have not been found, yet the optimism has died hard, and some pure fantasy has crept into textbooks.
You would think it would be a clue to you that this guy who believes in evolution very strongly would say something that to you seems to go against evolutionary theory. Any reasonable person would take the hint from that the quote maybe isn't being read the way it was intended, and it might just be another quote mine. Luckily, I happen to have a copy of this letter, and yes indeed it is a quote mine. What Ropp talks about in the letter is the misconception that a theory of evolution such as Darwinian natural selection is used to place fossils in order. He points out that, to the contrary, the theory actually explains the existing order which was recognized and used to fully develop the geological timescale before 1840, long before Darwin's Origin of Species. Your specific quote mine piece about the predictable progressions was used in reference to the fact that, quote, in the fossil record we're faced with many sequences of change. Modifications over time from A to B to C to D can be documented, and a plausible Darwinian interpretation can often be made after seeing the sequence. But the predictive or postdictive power of theory in these cases is almost nil. End quote. In other words, the key word was not progressions, but predictable. And your quote mine is predictably irrelevant and dishonestly represented.
They tell the kids they have evidence of evolution from fossils. I don't think so.
Listen, viewers, I think somebody better call the entire biology and earth science community and tell them the bad news. Kent Hovind thinks they're wrong. And he has a PhD, you know. He found it on the back of his placemat at Denny's. Game over, man! Game over!
That is stupid, okay? If you find a fossil in the dirt, all you know is it died.
Let's be clear here, you find fossils in the rock. But yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment. What if nobody had ever found a fossil before, and somebody found the very first one, say a T-Rex? What would they know? Well, they could probably guess that it was alive at some point and that it died, and they could study the properties of the rock and so forth, but they wouldn't be able to place it in any sort of progression, so they wouldn't be able to say anything much about its place in the history of life, especially considering that this weird fossilist culture probably has zero understanding of geology. Fortunately, we don't live in your odd little thought experiment, and we've found hundreds of millions of fossils in a consistent order, thereby giving us a very good idea of their place in the history of life. So your statement has no application to reality, but go on.
You don't know that it had any kids, do you?
No. Obviously, we don't know the family status of each individual T-Rex. Maybe one of these days we'll get lucky and find some fossilized tax returns.
And you sure don't know that it had different kids.
Different kids. Different from what? Its other kids? Or itself? What would even be the other option? Either one T-Rex makes a second T-Rex and you have two different T-Rexes, or you're just cross-eyed.
I mean, think about it. You're in a court of law. You bring in a bone to the judge. Judge, I found this bone in the dirt. This is the ancestor of all the humans today. They would laugh at you. You don't know that that's the ancestor of anybody, do you?
Of course you don't! Of course you fucking don't! And it doesn't matter because that's not what fossils are supposed to show. Nobody gives a damn if the specific individual reproduced. Individuals only serve as a snapshot of populations at a given time. It's about which species exist at any given point in the fossil record. It's not about which individuals were ancestors to the later species. And when we talk at higher levels, that even goes for individual species. You know, I didn't think this actually required any explanation for anyone. But apparently, when I'm talking to you, I'm reaching beyond the bottom of the intellectual barrel. I'm lifting up the barrel and finding that weird crusty old black stuff that leaked out 6 months ago and stuck the barrel to the floor so hard I had to go at it with a chisel.
And why on earth would you think a bone in the dirt can do something animals today cannot do?
Go into a museum for free?
Animals today can only produce the same kind, right?
Oh, that. Well, I have no idea if animals can only produce the same kind since nobody's ever told me what a kind is.
Dogs produce dogs, folks.
Yeah, but you don't need this wispy fart of a word, kinds, to know that. Let me say it for you in a way that actually means something. All animals produce descendants of the same species. If two animals of the same subspecies reproduce, they'll produce animals of the same subspecies. If two dogs of the same breed reproduce, they'll produce a dog of the same breed. Anything else would debunk the theory of evolution by natural selection.
Luther Sunderland asked all the major evolutionists.
Who exactly are all the major evolutionists? That term doesn't mean anything. Frankly, just the fact that you expect me to believe that someone asked all the major evolutionists something pretty much tells me that whatever you're going to say next is bullshit.
He said, where is the evidence for evolution? They all said, well, somebody else has it. We don't have it over here.
And look at that, it's bullshit. Before I accept that steaming load, I'm going to need to see all the statements from all the people he actually talked to in full. But I doubt that's going to happen.
So he wrote a letter to Colin Patterson. He's the director of the British Museum of Natural History. They've got the largest fossil collection in the world. He said, Mr. Patterson, I read your book on evolution. I noticed you didn't show us the missing links. Why didn't you show us the missing links? Patterson wrote back and said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line, there is not one such fossil.
Before I get to the quote mine, I just want to correct you on a couple things. The man's name is Colin Patterson with 2 T's. And you left out the last few words of his sentence, which I'm sure was just an honest mistake. You know, like all the others. The words in the ellipsis are, quote, for which one might make a watertight argument, end quote. Now, here's a letter from Dr. Patterson to Lionel Toynison from Talk Origins on August 16th, 1993, which shows the continuation of the quote, which is, quote, the reason is that statements about ancestry and descent are not applicable in the fossil record. Is Archaeopteryx the ancestor of all birds? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. There's no way of answering that question. It's easy enough to make up stories of how one form gave rise to another and to find reasons why the stages should be favored by natural selection. But such stories are not part of science, for there's no way of putting them to the test. End quote. Frankly, Kent, based on how mineable that last part of the quote is, I'm surprised you didn't choose to mine that instead. I mean, it was available on Talk Origins for 5 years prior to your speech, after all. Anyway, the extended quote makes it very clear that he's actually referring to exactly what we were just talking about a moment ago, direct descent between specific individuals or species, which, as I explained, would be absurd and unnecessary to expect. As Dr. Patterson notes, the creationist interpretation of his quote is false, and since his encounter with creationists, he's learned to be more circumspect in dealing with them. And so he should be, since plenty of them, yourself included, will twist any word and tell any lie to make it just that little bit easier to believe the unbelievable.
There are no missing links, folks. No chain is missing.
If you define link as every single individual that led to modern life, then no, we don't have those. Obviously. At least not all of them. We have really no idea if we have any of them, nor can we ever tell if we do, as a matter of fact. But the fossils we have do show the transition, regardless of whether those specific individuals or even those individual species were ancestors of modern life.
Even Stephen Gould admitted the absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages is a persistent and nagging problem for evolution.
The size of the gaps we're talking about here is basically what you were talking about earlier, the so-called missing links at the species and genus level. Since you like quoting Gould so much, why don't you put this one in your next speech? From the document linked in the description, quote, since we proposed punctuated equilibria to explain trends, it is infuriating to be quoted again and again by creationists, whether through design or stupidity, I do not know, as admitting that the fossil record includes no transitional forms. Transitional forms are generally lacking at the species level, but they are abundant between larger groups. End quote. Mr. Hovind, this isn't a question of whether there's evidence for evolution. It's not even a question of which mechanism drives it. It's simply a question of how quickly and consistently that mechanism drives it in particular situations. Now to your specific quote mine. You know, Ken, when you quote mine someone who's perhaps most famous for being in favor of punctuated equilibrium, or in other words, an erratic pace of evolutionary change, and then you put an ellipsis between nagging problems for and evolution, it makes it pretty easy to figure out that you palmed a card. The words you've so conveniently hidden under that ellipsis are gradualist accounts of. It seems you knew it was a problem that the quote referred to gradualist accounts of evolution, so you just snipped that bit out and pretended the problem didn't exist. So it's a boringly standard Stephen Jay Gould quote mine that confuses gradualism for evolution, which creationists love to use because... I'm not really sure, actually. Why do creationists love quote mining scientists so much? Are you trying to create the impression that scientists like Mary Leakey and Stephen Jay Gould didn't actually accept the theory of evolution? That'd be more than a little silly, since clearly they do, and at best what you'd achieve is showing that someone disagreed with the consensus, which would say nothing about the consensus. Or are you trying to imply that they publicly discussed problems with the theory? I'm not really sure what that would prove, even if your quotes were accurately represented then, other than that scientists are honest people who are willing and able to identify deficiencies in their theories. Or maybe you're trying to say there's some sort of vast scientific conspiracy to cover up problems with the theory? But then either your quote mines must be false, or major scientists have been running around for decades publicly declaring that it's all bunk while still being in on the conspiracy somehow, which would make no sense at all. Or are you trying to imply that they're all satanic atheists who know God exists and created the world 6,000 years ago and they suppress the truth in their unrighteousness, but there's this little God center in their brain that compels them to occasionally debunk the theory of evolution while they're talking in its favor, like a minor case of creationist Tourette's syndrome?
We got the theory, we know it's true, now we just need the evidence. That's the way they think about it.
Oh, look, little Kenty's trying to play with the big kids and he found a Stephen Jay Gould quote mine. Let's just pretend that he won the game, okay? I don't want to hurt his widow feelings. Good job, Lil Kenty! Yeah, one quote mine is all it takes to establish that the entire scientific community believes there's no evidence for evolution. You win! All the big bad scientists are gonna pack up and go home now, and you can put on your cape and play superhero in the lab. But you be good and don't touch any chemicals, okay?
Richard Goldschmidt said, maybe the first bird hatched from a reptile egg.
Okay, Lil Kenty, let me mark your homework. Okay. It's not Gouldschmidt, it's Goldschmidt. You're confusing him with Stephen Jay Gould. Richard Goldschmidt never said that. That so-called Goldschmidt quotation is actually Goldschmidt quoting Otto Schindewolf in his book. Goldschmidt's idea of macromutations, that is, mutations that affect unusually large phenotypic change in an individual, has nothing to do with punctuated equilibrium, the idea of occasional accelerated periods of evolutionary change in populations due to increased selection pressure and longer periods of stasis when there's less selection pressure. Goldschmidt did not propose anything as ridiculous as a crocodile laying a duck, but rather something more like a fish being born with a mutation of placing its eyes on one side of its head. Extremely small changes compared to your absurd example, but larger than the much smaller changes typically associated with evolution. But hey, you got the book's name and the page number, right? Bing, bing! That's like getting nothing but your name right on an exam. You get an F. You're staying for detention to redo your homework, little Kenty.
Here's what happened. Charlie Darwin graduated from Bible college to be a preacher in the Anglican Church in 1830.
Charles Darwin graduated from Christ's College at Cambridge, not Bible College, in 1831, not 1830, with a Bachelor of Arts as a prerequisite for a divinity course to become an Anglican parson.
He couldn't get a job, so his dad pulled a few strings and got him a job on board HMS Beagle.
Charles was on a field trip to Wales studying geology under Adam Sedgwick in the summer of 1831 after the completion of his bachelor's degree at Cambridge University. Upon his return home in August, he found a letter from his friend and botany professor, John Stevens Henslow, proposing him as a naturalist for the HMS Beagle. Charles's father, Robert Darwin, initially opposed the journey, but his brother-in-law, Hosea Wedgwood, persuaded him.
He's going to sail around the world and collect bugs.
Charles's job as a naturalist on the Beagle meant that he served as a geologist, botanist, and zoologist, not just an entomologist, and certainly not just as a bug collector, as you imply. What exactly was the purpose of inventing an entirely fictional biography of Charles Darwin?
And while he's sailing around, he stopped off at these islands right there called the Galapagos Islands. There on those islands, Charlie noticed there were 14 different varieties of finches. Charlie studied the birds very carefully and said, you know what, I think all these birds had a common ancestor. I bet you're right, Charlie. It was a bird.
Yeah, the most recent common ancestor of every one of those birds was a bird. Go figure.
And then Charlie said in his book on page 170, he said, it is a truly wonderful fact that all animals and all plants throughout all time and space should be related to each other. Now, hold on a minute. You see 14 kinds of birds, and you conclude that birds and bananas are related. That's stupid.
What's stupid is that you didn't bother to read the book, and so you think his only evidence was that he saw 14 kinds of birds.
You should conclude that those 14 kinds of birds had a common ancestor, but that's as far as it ever goes, folks, okay?
If the only evidence you have is 14 kinds of birds, then yeah. Fortunately, the significance of the birds wasn't that they comprised his entire body of evidence, it was that they helped spark the idea of natural selection, which he then proceeded to research further.
I don't know of a kind way to say it, Charlie, but that's stupid. Okay, we don't ever see a bird produce a non-bird.
Maybe you should hope that someday we do. After all, that sort of thing is what many people would call a miracle. If that happened, the theory of evolution would be debunked, and some biologists might even be so puzzled that they'd explain away their ignorance of the cause by appealing to your universe-speaking wizard.
See, dogs produce dogs, and you might get quite a variety of dogs. Roses produce roses. That is called microevolution.
No, that's called evolution. It's exactly what the theory of evolution by natural selection states will happen. Dogs producing roses would be a major problem for the theory. Dogs producing dogs is a prediction of the theory.
Now that is a fact, folks. It happens. It is observable. It is scientific. I don't think we ought to use that word, microevolution. We should just call it a variation. But they use it, so just so I qualify that, it's a lousy term. It gives what's called a free rider effect to the rest of the 5 religious ideas of evolution.
I love how far you people are backed into the corner at this point. You've gotten to the point where you can't deny that Darwinian evolution occurs, at least to some ill-defined extent, without even your audience thinking you're a whack job, and it just tears you up, you can tell. It's glorious.
You might get a big dog or a little dog, but you're always going to get a dog when you crossbreed your dogs. And I would go so far as to say probably the dog, the wolf, and the coyote had a common ancestor.
Oh yeah? Can you show me the missing links? But yeah, we're on the same page about that. Common descent with modification produces different species. But now you're claiming that you have some method by which you can classify animals into distinct kinds. That means that you surely must have a concrete definition of kind that you're not telling me, and that you have ways to identify which animals belong to which kind. So help me to understand. Do foxes belong to dog kind, or are they their own kind, and why? Is this based on comparative anatomy or genetics? Or what about the dhole? It has more teats and fewer teeth than the Canis genus, but it looks like a dog. Or how about a banana? How about a raccoon dog? It's classified as a canid. Or for that matter, how about an actual raccoon? It looks related to dogs, and its genus name Procyon even means dog-like. Would you say the same? Maybe you include all these in your common descent from a dog-like ancestor 4,400 years ago, which would be some pretty spectacularly supercharged evolutionary change. Maybe not. But the point is, there has to be some mechanism by which you identify which animals are of the same kind. And more importantly, there has to be some mechanism by which changes stop before animals fail to be classifiable as the same kind. This means that for you to be correct, there must be some genetic mechanism by which descendants are prevented from becoming more genetically different after they've varied a certain amount from the original pair on the ark. And there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be able to detect such a genetic brick wall. Have you found it? Can you present it?
This Irish textbook shows different dogs, and it calls it divergent evolution. Oh, come on, giving it a fancy name doesn't change a thing. It is still a dog.
That's not a particularly fancy name. By fancy, do you actually mean meaningful? Or perhaps useful?
And a 3-year-old can tell you. Anybody in here 5 years old? Who's 5 years old?
Hey, you said a 3-year-old can tell you. Ask a 3-year-old, you cheater.
5 years old. What's your name? Misty. Here we have a dog, a wolf, a coyote, and a banana. Which one is not like the others? Dog, wolf, coyote, and banana. Banana. All right, let's give Misty a hand. Very good. The other ones.
Okay, you answered my question about how you classify animals into kinds. Ask Misty the 5-year-old. Well, you're probably still going to get a smarter answer than if you ask the typical adult creationist. So we classify kinds by putting them into groups of 4 items, and whichever 3 a 5-year-old thinks are the most alike are a kind, eh? Okay, let's try it. Okay, Misty? Hi, Misty. Which one's not like the others, Misty? And now? How about now? And what about now? Thanks, Misty. I'm glad we agree that by Kent's logic, humans, snails, and bananas are all the same kind.
See, variations happen within the dog kind. You get a big dog or a little dog, but there are limits to these variations.
Oh, good. You've told me the totally scientific way you determine the borders of kinds, and now you're going to describe the mechanism behind these limits.
Haven't the farmers been trying to breed for bigger pigs for a long time? They try to get the biggest pig they can, don't they? Do you think they'll ever get a pig as big as Texas? I bet there's a limit in there somewhere, isn't there? Mm-hmm.
I see. So the limit of kind is that if an animal gets as big as Texas, it becomes a different kind. And so environmental, structural, and neurological factors, and not genetic factors, define the borders between kinds? I mean, we agree that if you bred pigs for millions of years with the goal of making them as large as possible, you wouldn't get them as large as Texas because the nervous system could no longer be controlled over such a distance, the gravity would crush the pigs under their own weight, and there wouldn't be sufficient oxygen, food, water, or space. But we're not arguing about the physical limits of life on Earth, we're arguing about the common descent of animals that can and do exist on Earth. So you've resorted to spouting irrelevancies and hoping your audience is stupid enough not to notice. How the hell can they sit there while you openly insult their intelligence to such a degree?
Roaches become resistant to pesticides after a while. Do you think they'll ever become resistant to a sledgehammer? I bet there's a limit. Yeah, okay.
Nor would they develop laser vision or the power to control the weather. Again, insultingly irrelevant unless becoming a new kind is synonymous with acquiring superpowers. Did you get your understanding of evolution from X-Men?
They still produce the same kind of plant or animal. That's not evolution. That's just a variation of the same kind, okay? And the information for that variety was already present in the gene pool. No new information is ever added.
Yes, it is.
The dogs or the pigs don't learn to fly or become pink.
Have you ever seen a pig? Or a shaved dog? They're kinda already pink. But no, there's no dog or pig breed that flies. The number of changes that would require is enormous. Their structure is so far from anything that could fly that it would take a really, really long time for the necessary changes to occur, if they ever did, and what you had by the time they could fly wouldn't be a dog or pig except in the cladistic sense. But there's no selection pressure pushing them in anywhere near that direction anyway, so it's silly to assume that this should happen. Oh, and by the way, I'll pretend that you didn't say you'd expect them to learn to fly.
Okay, there's no new information added, just scrambled information.
You haven't defined the word information, except with your 2 examples of new traits, one of which was actually a common trait already. But regardless of what you actually mean, you're wrong. Scrambled information is new information, unless you think adding dog and god to the dictionary only required adding 1 new word. Replacement without changing the amount of information also results in new information, as when you change God to rod. And if you mean an increased amount of information, then insertion and duplication increase the amount of information, which can then be modified.
And the gene pool of the new variety is now more limited than before.
The gene pool of the new variety. Just of the new variety? As in, the gene pool suddenly excludes the old varieties for some reason? Maybe because it's a purebred gene pool, which is only smaller because humans enforce it. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that's not what you mean, since it's so boneheadedly irrelevant. But how about the gene pool of dogs in general? The gene pool is all the genetic information in the population we're concerned with, in this case the whole species plus coyotes, which you said were related to dogs. Now, let's say you started with the representatives of dog kind coming off Noah's Ark, which we'll say is 1 wolf and 1 dog. I'm using an example you'll understand, see. And let's say that somehow you bred them into all modern dogs, wolves, and coyotes, even though so little genetic diversity would almost certainly result in extinction. If you did this and produced all those different varieties, even if purely by scrambling information, as you say, and not by increasing the amount of information in any genome, you still would have more information in the gene pool at the end than at the start, not less. Because, to use a common analogy, the dictionary of the gene pool contains more unique words than it did originally, generated by scrambling letters. And as a result, the gene pool has become less limited and more able to adapt to future changes. Oh, one more thing. You put up a picture that says Chihuahuas can't produce Great Danes, which is so completely irrelevant to this that I can't begin to imagine what you meant by it.
Somebody spent years crossbreeding dogs to develop a Chihuahua. All that work to make a dog that is 100% useless. Let's turn all the Chihuahuas in the world loose back into the woods. How long would they last? They'd run up to the wolf. Yep, 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 yep. Crunch. Go ahead, make my day. A useless dog. Genetic information was lost when you got your variation. It wasn't added.
So, your definition of adding new information is that the animal is useful and able to fend for itself in the woods. Please tell me that isn't what you mean and that I'm just taking your terrible non-joke too seriously. On the other hand, it'd be kind of funny if that's what you meant, because it'd mean that you contain no more information than a Chihuahua, being both useless and likely unable to fend for yourself in the woods.
You might have selected a certain slice of the gene pool with small dog, quick characteristics, but you didn't add anything. You selected something from the population.
So the argument is selection isn't mutation, therefore mutation doesn't add information? That's seriously your argument here? And you're talking as though all the dog characteristics that you might select were already present in the 2 specimens that came off Noah's Ark, and no mutations except maybe deletions were required to get all modern dogs, wolves, and coyotes. Well, that should be easy enough for you to prove, since you have the DNA of all modern dogs, wolves, and coyotes to compare to each other. Funny thing is, though, that you've kind of been proved laughably wrong already. But please, feel free once you get out of prison to waste a bunch of time trying to prove that yourself.
I come from Illinois, corn country. There are so many kinds of corn up there, they have to number them. You'll be driving down the highway, you'll see BX65, don't mix it up with XL29, something will blow up. But I'll tell you what, folks, you can crossbreed your corn from now till the cows come home, and you always get corn. You will never get a hamster or a tomato or a whale to grow on that corn stalk, okay? It won't happen.
Who told you the theory of evolution predicts they would? We've descended to the level of superhero cockroaches and Texas-sized pigs again. Let me explain this very clearly to you. According to the theory of evolution, an animal is not going to evolve into a plant or onto a plant. It's not going to happen, and it's never happened, just like the Texas-sized pig in the Genesis myth never happened. If you were confident in the bankruptcy of evolution, you would argue against the actual theory of evolution for once, not your made-up version that I'm sure even your new friend Misty the 5-year-old can tell is bullshit. But of course you know you can't argue against the actual theory, which is why you continue to misrepresent it. You've run away from a fight you lost, and now you're talking big talk to your friends while you hold ice on your black eye. You're nothing but a tasteless joke.
You're a fucktard, aren't you, Kent? You're a fucktard, aren't you, Kent? I don't think he knows the shit that he believes is just a fucking joke. But what is really sad is people out there buying into the shit he preaches.
Fuck, that was terrible again, but I'll take it.